Oh, we need to do some quality control with our grad students, I think.
You mean with the classes or with just the students in general?
with the classes they teach. Okay, so last time we started talking about language. Oh, so how about that weather? Nice, huh? It was, what, 70 degrees on Monday and high of 30 today? Yeah. Welcome to March. Okay, so last time we talked about language. And we started talking about sort of definitions of language, semantics and syntax a little bit. We're going to come back to that. Hopefully we'll get to that today. And we got through phonemes. So phonemes are, so let's start off. What are phonemes? Right, the smallest parts of language. They're the sounds, right? And they're the smallest parts that convey different meaning. Well, no, that's a morpheme. They're the smallest parts that can signal different meanings. So the difference between cat and caught. So some languages, you can imagine that you don't have the distinction between an at and an ah. So cat and caught are the same words, just pronounced differently, right? But in English, those two mean different things because we have different phonemes. The a and the ah are different phonemes in English. All right, so why are phonemes hard? Why is it hard to understand phonemes? Right, not all languages have the same ones. So if you're learning a different language, for example, then they're going to have phonemes you don't. They're going to lack phonemes that you do have. What else? Yeah.
Co-articulation, so like the same ones depending on the vowel.
Right, exactly. So co-articulation, which means that you start saying the vowel sound while you're still saying the current phoneme. So you pronounce them together, and so individual phonemes, even though it's the same phoneme, technically it sounds different. Any other reasons?
Just dialects, accents, and idiosyncratic ways of speaking. Everyone says the same phoneme is a little bit different.
Right, yeah, so you get lots of variability in phoneme production. Sorry, Michael, you snooze, you lose.
Yeah.
Got to come to class on time to get a seat. Where are we going with that? Are there any seats in the back? They're all sort of stacked up there.
I had one of those last night.
So we have 50 seats in this classroom. So they're all stacked up in the back. All right, so yeah, so phonemes can, you've got variability basically in phoneme production. They're produced fast, they're produced differently depending on the context, etc., etc. So how do we get around these things? What does the system do in order to make it easier for you to understand phonemes? Crickets. Did I tell you about my friend who fakes a seizure every time there's
What?
epileptic absence? He just rolls his eyes and pretends he's having a seizure when there's silence in class. He's a little weird. Tori.
So we hit them over a spectrum so that certain variabilities all heard as the same thing.
Right, yeah, so you have categorical perception, right? So you can vary the voice onset time between a D and a T. So T's, you start moving your vocal cords a little bit later, and so if you move those things together, it's not like you hear something halfway between a D and a T. You hear either a D or a T. So you take sort of things that can vary on a continuum and you sort of move them apart and make them different than one another. So your perception is of one or the other. It's categorical.
What about when you mishear words? Like,
Ooh, good question.
I can't think of an example right now, but I know I mishear words all the time.
I've got lots of examples because that's kind of the next topic, right? So as we move up into words, you sort of take the phonemes that are present, and depending on the context that the word sits in, you can hear something different. And sometimes you hear completely the wrong thing, and you sort of have to do a double take, right? So yeah, I've got lots of examples of this, so I'll show you in just a minute. Caleb.
So, like you said, context would be another way that we can distinguish phonemes?
Right, yeah. So you get the phoneme restoration effect, where, say, you're listening to a sentence and then somebody coughs in your ear, or the speaker coughs or something like that. So you miss that phoneme, but you don't notice that the phoneme is missing. You sort of fill it in, just like the blind spot in vision. You do some filling in. Daniel?
I've got an example of that. When I was learning Italian, they have two different words, mezzo and mezza. One means half, and the other one's like among. And for about 6 months, I didn't remember which was which, and so I just say mezz and then give some random inarticulate vowelish sounding thing at the end, and nobody noticed.
That's just your accent, right? That you just,
yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Other ways that we get around phoneme difficulties. So we talked about phoneme restoration effect, categorical perception. There was a third one. It involved a video. The audio and the video were different.
Visual, like function and top.
Right. Yeah. So you can use visual information to supplement what may be ambiguous in the auditory stream. So the specific example that we gave was the McGurk effect, where you hear ba, 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 and it looks like ga, 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 but when you see them together, perception is something in between of da, 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 or ta, ta, ta. Right. All right, so that's phonemes, and that's what we spent the whole time talking about. I hope today to get through 3 times as much stuff as we did last time. And there's no way that we're going to do it. All right, so why are words hard to understand? And we sort of talked about this last time, that the speech stream is continuous. So if you go to a foreign country where you don't speak the language, Canada, for example, and no, seriously, I went to Montreal. Everybody speaks French there, and it's amazing. And I was expecting, half of everything to be in English.
It's not French.
It's not French?
I do customer service in French because I went to France, my mission, and it's all Canadian people. I had no idea what they're saying.
Okay, so they speak some pidgin version of French there. But at any rate, I don't speak the language, and apparently Steve doesn't either. And it just sounds like continuous stuff. And I know a couple of words in French, but I couldn't pick out anything, right? So there's no real break. So if you look at the speech spectrogram, so this is time on the x-axis and then frequency on the y-axis, and then the darker it is, the more power there is in that frequency band. You can see that there's not really any breaks here. So a silence looks like this, where there's nothing going on, right? So if the sentence is, I can see you, there's a small silence before the K sound in can, but between can see you, nothing. So there's no breaks in there. So we have to use meaning and context. We have to bring some sort of top-down processes to bear on sort of parsing this and figuring it out. So after you're in the country for a while, as you sort of learn the language, you can start picking out words that you recognize, right? Because you're using your past experience, you're using your memory to sort of cue in on these things and say, oh, yeah, I understand that. All right, so we often mishear words. So this is sort of getting back to Ariel's question. And we mistake how to segment speech. And this often happens in music. In music lyrics. So in the Beatles' She Loves You, you may hear, instead of pride can hurt you, frighten her kazoo. Beat it, beat it. We were actually listening to this morning as I was making pancakes. So beat it can be misheard as heated, heated. Should old acquaintance be forgot? So this one's really easy because it's completely meaningless, right? Auld Lang Syne. What is that song even about? So, should old acquaintance be for what? Makes as much sense as should old acquaintance be forgot. Jose, can you see? How many of you as kindergartners were convinced that you were singing about Jose? I totally was. Jose, can you see by the dawn's early light? What is a dawnzer? Right, yeah. And this one, I still, to this day, I know that this is the lyric, but I always hear this. And, it's Jimi Hendrix, and so, he wears purple pants, and he could be kissing a guy just to be avant-garde, but...
My sister was convinced that 13 Article of Faith told us we believed in being chased by an elephant.
Any others? Abby?
I thought the song Book of Mormon stories, instead of Lamanites and others who were seeking liberty, was sipping liver tea.
That sounds really disgusting. Sipping liver. Ariel?
The song with all the Book of Mormon names, my little brother, you know like how it goes, Nephi, or Jacob, Enos, Jeremiah. I thought it was Jacob.
I'm never going to forget the order of those books now. Rachel?
My little cousin, like, she said her family prayer, and in her prayer she said, like, and bless Pocahontas. So then my aunt and uncle were trying to figure out what she was saying, because I guess they always said it, and it was bless no harm upon us. So she thought they were saying bless
Pocahontas. I like that. That's nice. How many of you learned when you learned the ABCs? It was elemento. Yeah. So everybody knows what an elemento is, right?
One of mine was more for when so I thought I was lactose intolerant when I was a kid.
Lactose intolerant. I can't stand lactose either.
I remember in elementary school, like these two boys I sat by were convinced there were two N's in the alphabet because Y and Z.
There's 27 letters. Can't you count? N gets repeated twice. Yes. So, yes, these things happen all the time, and it hugely depends on context, right? So if you're expecting letters, then another N makes as much sense as the word and in there, right? Because everybody sort of abbreviates that sort of stuff. So the meaning really affects our perception of these things. So with songs, with old beef or what was it again? All the Quintons beef or what? Right, so if you've got no context, then sure, that makes as much sense as anything else. I don't speak Spanish, and so my version of La Bamba is probably pretty hilarious if you actually know the actual lyrics. I was going to make a joke about my wife and music lyrics, but I think I'll refrain. So the meaning of the sounds affects our perceptual organization of these things. So what I'd like you to do is, for the following phrases, try and make them into a meaningful phrase. Oh, and this would be better with an animation so you don't see them all at once, but oh well, here they are. Ask him, oak, hiss. Eskimo kiss. Weed, heap, heap, hull. We the people. Thumb, hiss, single, ink. The missing link. Bees, load, who, anchor. I'm just slurring these things together. Be slow to anger. High, wiper, troll. Highway patrol. Tempo, might, hung. Tip of my tongue. All right, so has anybody played this game before? The Mad Gab? Yeah, so what's the best strategy for playing Mad Gab? Say it fast or listen to other people. So don't read the words, because that's going to mess you up. Why does reading the words mess you up? Right, exactly. So you're thinking about oak trees. Oak hiss? What's an oak hiss? And that's wrong, right? So thinking about the meaning of those words is going to mislead you from the words from the other phrase that you actually need. So if you say it fast, if you slur it together, and if you don't look at what the words are, then it's much easier to do. So when I play Mad Gab, I don't even hang out in the same room as everybody else. I make my teammates yell it to me in the next room, and I'll yell it back. And, it makes the people I'm playing against really angry. Sit down at the table. Come on. All right. So how do we perceive words? So most researchers think that there's a process between the input of the words coming in and interpreting them and a mental lexicon, so this dictionary that you're carrying around in your head. So each lexicon entry has things like the pronunciation. So if the word is black, then you've got the pronunciation, the spelling, the part of speech, a pointer to the meaning of the thing. So it's probably not stored right there, it's probably stored in the semantic network. So it directs the system to another location where the meaning is actually stored. And so the question is, does everything get access to the mental lexicon? So as you're hearing a speech stream, for example, or as you're reading a sentence, does everything that you're seeing, does all the input get access to the mental lexicon? And what about if you mispronounce things? Does that get access to the mental lexicon, depending on the context? So to test this, you can do what's called cross-modal priming. Have we talked about priming? We did talk about priming when we talked about memory. Did we? Did we do the cow joke in here? Say silk 10 times fast, what do cows drink? No? We didn't do that. Okay. From the blank stares that I'm getting, we didn't do that in here. All right. So priming is just where you have experience with prior stimuli and you're faster at processing those stimuli later on. So I can do stem completion priming. I need to start bringing a marker to class. I can do stem completion priming where I show you a list of words, and if window is on that list, and then later on I give you some other task in the middle, and then later on I give you WIN blank, fill in the blank with the first word that comes to mind. If you've seen window before, then you're 30% more likely to say window for the stem completion. Otherwise, you may say something like winner or winter or something else. But if you've seen window, if you've been exposed to window, then you're more likely to come up with this stuff. You've been primed with window. And you can do this sort of thing with with concepts as well. So if I say, if you saw doctor on the list before, I give you NUR blank, you fill it in with nurse. So it's semantic priming as well. So the question is here, if you do this cross-modal priming, so if you hear something that contains the word hats in it, and then I give you a recognition or a lexical decision task. So you're seeing words and non-words on the screen, and you just have to decide, is this a word or not a word? So it might be hat, it might be blick. So hat would be a word, blick would be a non-word, right? So if you've heard hat, then you're faster at processing it than if you hadn't heard anything. So we can look at your average reaction times, and the stuff you've had exposure to previously, as long as it's gained access to the lexicon, you're going to be faster at. So the question is, so we do this sort of cross-modal priming. So in one modality, in auditory processing, you hear hat, and then in visual processing, you see hat. The question is, are you faster at processing it? And it turns out that in this case, yes. Now the question becomes, what if we mess with things? What if instead of hearing hats, you hear hacks? And does that gain access to the lexicon? And so does that gain access to the entry for hat? And so are you faster at processing hat in this case? What do you guys think? Yeah? So if you heard hacks, so at the turn of the century it was typical for gentlemen to wear hacks in the evening, what would you think? Hats, right. So you'd think, oh, I must have misheard that or something like that because hats is the thing that fits in best there, right? And so you would think that you're pretty good at that, and it turns out that no, you're not. So originally it looked like the mental lexicon was pretty picky about what gets access. Hacks would get access to the hack would not get access to the lexicon, and the lexicon was pretty discerning about what it let in. Except not really. So later research showed that mispronounced words do get access, but they have to be mispronounced in a way that's pretty typical. So, for example, if you have something like pine bench versus pine bench, you might actually hear this in typical speech. Why might you hear something like pine bench? Helps if you say it. Pine bench.
Your mouth would be closing in preparation to say B.
Right, exactly. So remember co-articulation? You're getting ready for this B while you're still saying pine. So if you're being lazy about it and just sort of slopping through it, you might expect people to actually say pine bench. Doesn't sound that weird, right? But if you have something like pine cupboard, that does sound weird because it's not a co-articulation. You're not getting ready for the K sound in cupboard with an M here. And so this is an unnatural change while this is a natural change. And so it turns out that people are faster for natural changes than for unnatural changes. So that's here. So if you have an unnatural change, then you don't get access to the mental lexicon. You have longer reaction times, meaning slower processing, than if you have a natural change. So Pime bench versus Pime covered. Pime covered, people don't hear that as being, people don't interpret that as being the right word. They think that that's a completely different word. What the heck is a pime? But here you say, oh, they must mean pine because they're going on to say bench. All right, so the point is, you get lexical access with mispronunciations if the mispronunciations are natural, if there's something that you would run into in everyday speech. So you can do sort of some filling in based on the context and based on your experience with knowing how people speak and what sort of mistakes people make. All right, so once you've got the words, you got to put them together into sentences. And for most languages, well, all languages have some traditions in word order. Languages like, well, sometimes Russian, Hungarian, do not have a fixed word order. They've got little, affixes that they stick on words to indicate parts of speech. So this wouldn't make much sense in Hungarian. But in English, Jane kissed John is very different from John kissed Jane, right? One may result in a lawsuit. They both might result in a lawsuit, depending on the willing parties. So even if the word order doesn't change much, you can have more than one meaning for a sentence. So here's one. Time flies like an arrow. Can this have multiple meanings? Yeah, maybe. All right, so what's the obvious meaning? What do we usually mean when we say time flies like an arrow? Time moves quickly, right? Or our perception of time is that it's fast. What other meanings might you get out of this? I've come up with 5. So you could assess the pace of flies as you would assess the pace of an arrow. So you're going to time flies like you would time an arrow. Assess the pace of flies in the same way that an arrow would assess the pace of flies. So time flies like arrows time flies. A particular variety of flies, time flies, adore arrows. Time flies like a particular arrow. Or you could assess the pace of flies, but only those flies that resemble arrows. So you can time flies like the arrows. Anybody come up with any others? Arrow?
A dog named Time.
Sorry?
A dog named Time.
Like an arrow. Okay. Any others? All right, so even if you got all the meaning, or all the individual words, sentences are still difficult. So how do we understand sentences? And here's where you all start drifting off and falling asleep, because we have to talk about grammar. And you have these horrible flashbacks to 7th grade in Mrs. Price's class, where you did sentence diagrams. Did anybody else do sentence diagrams in 7th grade? Okay, so this is you may have repressed these things, but we need to talk about these, because they actually tell us something about how we understand language. Much as it chagrins me to say that Mrs. Price was right. Hated that class.
Price is right.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so to understand sentences, we need to talk about grammar, and we're not necessarily talking about what the grammar that Mrs. Price tried to enforce with an iron fist in her class. So it's not the sort of programmatic rules that we talk about in 7th grade. So it's not things like you can't have split infinitives, and subjects and verbs do have to agree, because otherwise you're not understandable. So what we are talking about is a descriptive grammar and not a proscriptive grammar. So does everybody understand the difference between those two? Sort of. Corey, you're nodding your head. What's the difference between proscriptive and descriptive?
Well, if it's proscriptive, it's telling you how you should act and what you should do, like Mrs. Price did. Never use the passive voice, never do this. Where descriptive is just saying what people do.
Right, exactly. So you can have something that's in a descriptive sense grammatically correct, but in a proscriptive sense is incorrect. So this reminds me of a joke. So some sage person, wise person, was saying, you can you cannot have, what was it? Shoot. I forget the whole setup. I only remember the punchline of this joke, which makes it not a very, very funny joke, so we'll skip it. I'll look it up, and I'll come back to it. All right, so we're basically talking about syntax now. So we have been talking about semantics, so the meanings of words, but let's talk about syntax. So you can have things that are grammatically correct, but semantically meaningless. So the first one is both grammatically correct and semantically meaningful. So the psychologist slept fitfully, dreaming new ideas. So I got this right out of your textbook. So this makes sense, right? So some people can have dreams. Psychologists are people, despite what you may think. And yeah, so you can dream new dreams. Fitfully, the slept new ideas dreaming psychologist. Neither grammatically correct nor semantically meaningful, right? So it doesn't make any sense on any level. This one is grammatically correct, but semantically meaningless. So the words are all in the right places. So the new idea slept fitfully, dreaming a psychologist, but it sounds like a dolly painting, right? So it sounds like it just doesn't make any sense. So semantically, no semantic meaning, but grammatically correct. So this is what we're talking about with grammar, is that you can understand the parts of speech put together, even though it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. So how do we understand this? How does this work? Well, one idea is that we assign sort of what we expect the next word to be based on the preceding word. These are called word chain grammars. So the idea is that if you have a sentence like this, the boy took his baseball bat and hit the blank, you pretty much know what the next word is going to be, or you know what to expect for the next word. So what would you expect the next word to be? What's the most likely word? Ball, right. But it could be something else, right? So it could be window, it could be squid, it could be little sister, it could be anything, right? So this grammar, wait a minute, what am I talking about? So, this grammar could produce this number 3 sentence. So it's grammatically correct, but semantically meaningless, right? So what if instead of the next word, you're just specifying the next part of speech? So instead of the boy took the baseball bat and hit the ball, it could be the boy took the baseball bat and hit the noun. And then the grammar that you have, sort of the assigning that's going on, is just you're expecting a noun here. So it could be a noun, but it also could be noun phrases. And then, so that doesn't really work because it could be ball, but it could be the big, fat, stinky yellow ball. And so the next word is not predicted by the previous word, right? So big, fat, stinky. And you could keep going on and on and on and on and on. Also, you have problems because word chain grammars don't take into account dependencies. So this is a sentence that a word chain grammar could come up with. So either you are tall or you are heavy. So these are sort of the options. Either, if or either, I or you, and then so based on I or you, you know what the next word is going to be, right? So if it's I, it has to be am. If it's you, it has to be are. So that's where word chain grammars work. But they don't work if either you, am, so this would not work. This is where it would signal errors. But here, this is a sentence that the word chain grammar could come up with, but it's wrong. So either you are tall, then you are heavy. Right? That doesn't make sense. Why doesn't that make sense? What have we skipped here? Either goes with or, right. So word chain grammars don't remember this. They're just looking at the previous word. They're not looking at these dependencies, right? So word chain grammars don't work because they don't remember these dependencies. Either goes with or, if goes with then. There are others. Plurals have to go together. So if you have a plural subject, you've got to have a plural verb, things like that. So languages have dependencies which can span many words. So you can start off your sentence either and then go on and on and on and on and on, and then have or and then go on and on and on and on. And people understand that, right? People keep track of these dependencies. And you can have dependencies that are embedded. So let me show you an example of that. So these are our dependencies. So verbs must agree with their subjects. Either implies an or. At implies a noun is coming up sometime. And you can have lots of stuff in between the dependencies. So here's our subject. The little dogs, whose master was the nastiest, most foul-mouthed monster who had ever simultaneously threatened me with litigation and tried to romance me, were quite loving to me. So that's a grammatically correct sentence. I don't know that anybody would ever actually utter that sentence. But dogs and were matches up. And so if they didn't match up, so the little dogs, blah, 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 are, well, let's see, was quite nice to me. It's hard to think of ungrammatical sentences. It sort of grates, right? So these are dependencies. Word chain grammars don't account for dependencies. Word chain grammars have a hard time with embeddedness as well. So embeddedness means that you can take these dependencies and stick them inside of one another, sort of like those nesting dolls that get smaller and smaller. So either Dan or Brian will go. So you can take that phrase and then embed that clause in another clause, forming either Brian or Dan will go, or Karen or John will go. So you've got two either ors going on, and you stick them all together and you can embed them, and you can continue to embed them and sort of nest them. It gets very confusing after a while, but it's grammatically correct. Embedding opportunities are infinite, so you would need an infinite word chain grammar generator in order to account for these things. So word chain grammars don't work. Probably closer to what is going on are these phrase structure grammars. So remember the sentence diagrams that Mrs. Price had you do, or your version of Mrs. Price? That's what these sort of look like. So phrase structure grammars use a hierarchical organization, and they're sort of, like those trees, those diagrams. So it's not linear like word chain grammars are. It's hierarchical, and you have sort of this mental representation of sentences that's sort of like a tree. We can diagram it out like a tree, and it's got different parts, different nodes in this hierarchy. So phrase structures specify a limited number of sentence parts and a limited number of ways that those parts can be combined. And if you violate those, then you've violated the grammar. So we've got a sentence. The simplest sentence is a noun phrase and a verb phrase, or a noun and a verb. A verb phrase can contain a verb and a noun phrase, so you can embed this verb and noun within this verb phrase. So a noun phrase could be either a noun, an adjective plus a noun, an article and a noun, and a verb, which could be embedded in here, could be an auxiliary plus a verb. So you get the embeddedness, you get all of these things that you can sort of pack into these things, and you get the relationships between them. You get the dependencies between them. So for example, if we have the boy hit the ball, we've got a noun phrase and a verb phrase. The noun phrase is composed of the article and the noun. The verb phrase is the verb plus another noun phrase, which is, again, an article and a noun. So we can embed these things together. So we have the boy hit the ball. We can take that clause and embed it within other things and stick them together with things like either and or. So a sentence is a noun phrase plus a verb phrase. You could have another sentence that is an either one sentence or another sentence, right? So you can sort of use these things to glue them together, these dependencies. So it seems that what's going on is as you're hearing utterances, as you're hearing speech sounds, you've got a mental parser, something that's taking these speech sounds and assigning them to different parts of speech. So if you hear the, then the parser is expecting a noun coming up pretty soon, right? So the is usually part of a noun phrase. So what cues does the parser pay attention to? Well, one of these things I just mentioned is keywords like the. Articles, definite articles, or just articles in general. imply nouns that are coming up, right? So you sort of expect that to happen. So this must be a noun phrase if you hear the word the. Word order matters for most languages. I'm going to say almost all languages, word order matters. And even if word order technically doesn't matter, there are ways that you say things in the language and ways that you don't say things in the language, although they're grammatically correct if you sort of mix things around. Context matters, but we're not necessarily going to talk too much about it yet. And then we will talk about this principle of minimal attachment because it leads to some weirdness. So keywords like articles, like I mentioned, indicate that a noun is going to follow. Who, which, and that indicate a relative clause. So something like the car that the man whom the dog bit drove crashed versus the car the man the dog bit drove crashed. These are both grammatically correct, technically. But one of them is easier to understand than the other one. Which one is easier? The first one? How many like the first one? How many like the second one? How many think that they're both completely unintelligible? So who's doing the crashing? The man, the dog, or the car? The car, right? The car is doing the crashing. And then we know that this is a relative phrase. So that the man whom the dog bit drove crashed, right? So the that in here tells us what's going on with the man and the dog, right? So the man and the dog are not doing the crashing, and that becomes obvious, or at least a little bit easier to understand with the that. I need to come up with a better sentence because I don't even understand that sentence anymore. All right, so one thing that the parser assumes is that sentences will be active. And it's easier to understand active sentences. So if you have active sentences that have this order, subject, verb, object. So this is why Mrs. Price says, don't use the passive voice. It's because it's hard to understand. So that's, the admonition of passive voice. Passive voice has the object first, right? The car was driven by the man instead of the man drove the car. So man drove the car is SVO. The car was driven by the man is OVS. Both are grammatically correct. One is active, one is passive. And if the parser is assuming that you're using active, then you're going to have to do some rearranging and say after the fact and say, oh, this is a passive voice. It's not active. So it's going to take you longer to read passive sentences than active sentences. Corey?
So in order to perceive it, your brain has to reorganize the sentence into subject, verb, object.
Not necessarily. It's just it needs to assign roles to things as they're coming in. And the default assignment is SVO, is subject, verb, object. If you're sort of in a passive voice mode and you're expecting passive voice, then it's going to be a little bit easier to assign things as they're coming in. But you can misassign things and have to go back and reassign them. So let me show you some examples of that. So when do we assign roles? So we obviously do it online, and not by waiting till the end of the sentence. So we don't hear the whole sentence and then go in and diagram it. We're basically doing it as we're hearing things because that's a lot more efficient to do it that way. So if I give you some of these garden path sentences, they're a little bit tricky. So the horse raced past the barn fell. So that's a grammatical sentence. It's not missing a comma or a semicolon or anything. What's doing the falling? The horse is doing the falling in that case. So it's a horse which has been raced past the barn and it fell. Right? So you could have a horse that's been raced. So the horse raced past the barn. All right, the man who hunts ducks out on the weekends.
Is that a complete sentence? Ducks are out on the weekends. Oh, that's
So the man who hunts ducks out on the weekends. If I add the pause in there, it makes a little bit more sense, right? So the pause allows the parser to sort of figure out what's going on. So instead of attaching ducks to hunt, so it's not the man who hunts ducks, it's the man who hunts, generally anything, he ducks out on the weekends, right? So what's going on with these is you're being led down a garden path. So this sort of implies hunts ducks. Oh, he hunts ducks. Wait, out on the week. Wait, what? So you get to the end, and then you have to go back and reassign things and say, oh, that's what's going on. So the cotton clothing is usually made from grows in Mississippi. Made of. Yeah, so wait, why is that one hard?
Does cotton describe clothing?
Oh, the cotton clothing is usually made of. Grows in Mississippi. Yeah, so I think that I've read these too many times. I know what they're all about. So it's the cotton that's doing the growing, right? It's not the cotton clothing that's doing the growing. The raft floated down the river, sank. So it's a raft which has been floated down the river, and it sank. All right, so the first few words lead the listener down a garden path. You start assigning things, you start assuming that you know what it's talking about, and then you get to the end and you find out those assumptions are wrong. So that's why they're called garden path sentences. But let's talk about the principle of minimal attachment, because this is sort of what's going on with these garden path sentences. So this is a lot of text on one slide. That's the problem with talking about language. All right, so the spy saw the cop with binoculars, but the cop didn't see him. Versus the spy saw the cop with a revolver, but the cop didn't see him. All right, so the structure seems to be the same, right? So we've got spy saw cop. We've just switched these two words. They're both nouns, but they lead to different interpretations, right? So in the first one, what does the spy have in his hands? Binoculars. In the second one, what does the spy have in his hands? You don't know. Nothing. So you're obviously not looking at the cop with a revolver. So the cop must have a revolver. So you have to switch things around, right? So the sentence on the left, the spy saw the cop with binoculars versus the spy saw the cop with a revolver. So here, this is easier to understand than this is, because this has fewer levels. This has fewer nodes going on than this one does. So here, you have to come up with another node, basically, another part of speech in order to understand it. So you read it slower. Tori.
The first sentence could just as well mean the cop had binoculars, right?
Yes, it could. So both of these could be this sort of structure here. So the spy saw the cop had binoculars, and the cop didn't see the spy. That's another interpretation. So that's one of those problems with interpreting sentences, right? That it's a little bit ambiguous, but it makes a lot more sense for the spy to have the binoculars, particularly if the cop can't see him and the spy is far away. So if the cop doesn't have binoculars, you do, you can see him from farther away and he's not going to see you. Right, so the sentence on the right, in the sentence on the right, revolver requires a new node be generated to represent that information, that noun phrase, and so it's harder to understand. So these phrase structures account for some of these ambiguities, just like Tori just pointed out. So the cop could have the binoculars. So it could be, you could have two different interpretations, both of which are equally likely. So they're frying chickens. So what are the two interpretations of that sentence? They're frying chickens.
Frying can describe the chickens.
Right, so they could be chickens for frying, or someone could be frying the chickens. So they're frying chickens and not baking chickens, or that could be interpreted both ways as well. Sorry?
Egg-laying chickens.
Yeah, not egg-laying chickens. They're frying chickens. Or they are frying chickens. So this is the verb phrase here, a compound verb, and the object, versus a noun and a verb phrase are frying chickens. So the adjective describes the noun chicken. All right, so these things. Oh, where did they go? They're in here somewhere. There they are. They're in the next slide. I don't know why I was skipping it. All right, so ambiguities in interpretations. 2 cars were reported stolen by Groveton police yesterday. So there's what the writer meant, which is that the police reported the stealing, or there's the other interpretation, which is that the police are stealing the cars, right? Cars are stolen by Groveton police. The license fee for altered dogs with the certificate will be $3, and for pets owned by senior citizens who have not been altered, the fee will be $1.50. For sale, mixing bowl set designed to please a cook with round bottom for efficient eating. All right, so leads to ambiguities. Ariel.
Is there a reason why we hear a sentence one way or another?
Top-down expectations. So you may be expecting to hear things one way, and you can violate those expectations. And that's a lot of what jokes rely on, is sort of violating those expectations. So...
but I mean, even with those sentences, some of them I heard correctly, I guess, and then some of them I heard kind of down the garden pathway.
Right, yeah. So, and some of it has to do with my inability to not put in some voice inflection to indicate those things. So if we had Siri reading these things, Siri would do a pretty good job of sounding like the machine that she is, and you wouldn't get the voice inflection. You just get sort of da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
And it's just going to be...
And yeah, it would be up to you to supply that missing information that I'm giving you usually with the voice inflection, with the pauses and things like that. See?
Just to go with that, Mac has this program that will read documents to you, and sometimes I'll have like huge things from classes and I'll know how to read it, but there's no voice inflection.
Mm-hmm.
So after like the 3rd sentence, I realized I had no idea what it's talking about, even though it's reading it exactly.
Right, yeah, my Kindle will do the same thing, and my son loves it because he doesn't have to read. And he can play Legos the whole time. And it'll read him stuff like White Fang and stuff, but it's all in this robot voice. And it's really hilarious to hear Jack London read by the robot voice. All right, so next time we'll talk about pragmatics, and then we will... Ooh, we've got a lot left. We'll talk about texts next time, too.